Hi guys, we're just wrapping up key concept 8.4 about the economy, causes of economic growth after World War II, and then talked about burgeoning private sector, federal spending, baby boom, technological developments that help spur economic growth. So today, on this video, we're going to look at key concept 8.4, the economy after 1945, and this is part 2 of that same key concept. This one really talking about migration. So the key question here, explain the causes and effects of the migration of various groups of Americans after 1945. And the key concept is that as higher education opportunities and new technologies rapidly expanded, increasing social mobility encouraged the migration of the middle class to the suburbs and of many Americans to the South and West. The Sunbelt region emerged as a significant political and economic force. Okay, and then I'm going to try and quickly go over 8.5, though I don't want to really make another video for it. Explain how mass culture has maintained or challenged the status quo. Mass culture became increasingly homogeneous after the war. Okay, so let's get into 8.4. Oops, I forgot to take this off. Okay, so is the growth of the suburbs. All these families that we talked about with the baby boom and the GI Bill, all of these new nuclear families are created, and they need some place to live. And remember, there's more of them than before because people are marrying younger, more Americans are getting married, and they're no longer living in traditional houses. So we actually do have a housing shortage after the war. So the GI Bill, remember, gives home loans, and so more Americans are just able to buy homes than ever before. So the Levitt brothers, Bill, I believe, was a CB during World War II, learned all of these new construction techniques that basically lead into like the prefab movement, but very much instead of, kitchens being handmade and artisanally made, you're going to have one kitchen and mass produce things off-site and then come in and just throw them up, kitchen cabinets, countertops, same thing with bathrooms. So they see this fantastic economic opportunity. They go out on Long Island, they find some farmland, purchase it, and they create Levittown, humbly named after themselves, which is the first planned community in the nation. Now, don't think of it planned as in some like planned communities now, like if your grandparents live in a planned community down in Florida and they have, a clubhouse and a swimming pool. These are just planned suburbs. No clubhouse, no swimming pools at first. So in 1947, they created Levittown, the first planned community in the nation, built 20 miles outside of New York City. By 1951, they had almost 17,500 homes. I think I gave you a similar statistic in the previous video by like 1952 or 1953. The homes are small, boxy, and identical. You saw that picture in the Cape Cod or the ranch where the two styles, and they're really just like a square that have, 2 or 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and some common area. And they build 36 houses a day. So to the people doing McDonald's, to the people doing suburbs, or Levittown specifically, I really tried to reinforce the concept that what Ford did in the 1920s to cars, people are going to replicate in the 1950s in all different types of things, even music, creating the first like boy bands, but suburbs, hamburgers, these are all scientific management going back way before Ford, and they're assembly lining these houses. And the houses are cheap and affordable, $8,000 a piece, and then the GI Bill is going to help GIs afford these homes. However, the dark side to Levittown is that the FHA had been created during the New Deal, the Federal Homeowners Association. It's going to limit purchasers to white families. Now, for decades, many historians consider this to be de facto. They just happen to exclude African Americans from home ownership. In the past 10 years, more and more evidence has surfaced that was, if not de jure as in the law, it was their official policy to not issue home loans to African American families. And it doesn't focus on cities. So cities are going to have multifamily housing units, apartment buildings. Today we think of like condos and townhouses. The FHA is going to limit their building construction loans and homeowner loans to single family units. And again, there is some evidence to suggest it was to eliminate African Americans from being able to secure home loans. So what this is going to lead, and hopefully this pops up when I hit this button, is white flight to the suburbs, as well as urban decay, because urban families, African American families, even other families in urban settings that aren't African American, just can't access loans. My husband's bringing me a slice of pizza. Just can't access loans and financing for housing in the urban areas. So this divergence where from the 1950s on, in which the cities are seen to decay more and more, where the suburbs grow, is really a result of where the American government and therefore American investors are put their money. Okay, we can come back to that, especially we'll come back to it, probably revisit it with the Great Societies. So part of that movement, I mean, Levittown is in New York. So Levittown and New York are in the snow belt, sometimes called the frost belt. One too many. There we go. However, a lot of these planned communities are going to happen in the South, and what we call the Sunbelt. People from the cold and snowy North move to warm, sunny South. Technically, the Sun Belt is usually considered under this line of latitude here. We do make this exception for Missouri, and then I think they try to keep most of California together. So this area becomes known as the Sun Belt. Today we have different, the Bible Belt is in here. This area where steel manufacturing has kind of gone down since the 1970s is sometimes called the Rust Belt. A belt is just another term for a region. And so the two main reasons people can move to the South is the reservoir system. Very much a response to the buildup of dams in the West as a result of the Newlands Reclamation Act, which I might have just briefly mentioned back in period 6 or 7. But things like the damming of the Hetch Hetchy that's going to provide water to San Francisco. But now you're going to have lots of reservoirs throughout the American Southwest, especially. Really from Texas over to California. So people can have water to drink and grow things and wash things and do all the things, flush things, everything we do water with. As well as air conditioning, which I mentioned in the last video for shopping malls. Because to be honest, do you want to live in like Florida, hot and humid in the summer without air conditioning? No. I do like a little dry heat, and I actually don't mind. Like I spent couple of weeks in Mississippi last summer. I don't mind the humidity, but it's not my favorite thing in the world. So Americans start moving to the Sun Belt, whether it's Florida, Texas, southern Arizona in some cases, and especially southern California. And you see that reflected in the Hollywood culture of the 1950s. But these places also have one thing in common, in that they have, especially in the American Southwest, a lot of available land, and it's flat. And so a lot of corporations are going to move there that have R&D contracts because they can build research and development facilities, whether it's chemical research and development, but a lot of aerospace and engineering. Developers and contractors will be in Texas, Arizona, and Southern California. Boeing, Lockheed, for example. In Florida, you also see that with like Disneyland. Disney is in Disneyland in Florida because there was so much available land that Disney was able to buy it super cheap. They're still actually Disney owns a lot of land in Florida that they haven't even developed yet because he is able to buy so much land for cheap in the 1950s. And so land was cheap there. This has led to a long-term, somebody is texting me if you can hear it. This has led to a long-term change in the Sun Belt. As it's become a more and more influence in our economy as well as politics. And you see that in this map, a change in congressional representation, 1970 to 2000. I could not find one for 1960. And see, like California gains 10 representatives. Today, the fact that California is considered a electoral college powerhouse is because of this change. Boeing, Lockheed, other government contractors, all here in Southern California, all the way up really until San Francisco. Same thing here in Arizona, New Mexico a little bit, Texas, Florida. And this is an ongoing change. And this has big implications today for environmental change about water resources. This reservoir system really changes the way we view water as almost a undepletable commodity. But now we are experiencing issues with water and environment. California has undergone a drought for, I think it's something like 8 of the last 10 years. With where population goes, so does our electoral college and representation, but also so does ecological change and ecological issues. We've terraformed these desert areas to support life, but that may not be sustainable in the long term. So these are some of the this is not just a political rant. This is a key concept later as we move on. And we see that continuing. I wish I would have thought of it at the time to do one as of 2010. And of course, this year is 2020 with another census. Texas keeps on growing as a electoral college powerhouse from these immigration changes, as well as, California. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the Sunbelt. Let's look at the key concept here. Explain the causes and effects of migration of various groups of Americans after 1945. So you have, to suburbs, no matter where they are, Snowbelt or Sunbelt, as well as movement to the Sunbelt. So you have suburbanization in Sunbelt. And yeah, let's move on. Okay, let's go. Okay, I paused it. I'm back. But I just ended by saying, let's move on. But there was one thing I wanted to mention on the suburbanization topic. And that the question is after 1945, right? And the key concept is about how after 1945, Americans move to the South and the West. Notice this is a contrast of, a theme we had talked about before, and a contrast and to some degree an addendum to, that during World War II, over 500,000 African Americans moved out of the South to the North and the West, right? So that Western migration is still going on, but during World War I, African Americans were moving to the North, and now you have this white flight away from urban centers, where you now have these new African American populations in two suburbs, as well as to the South. Okay, so just wanted to show that complexity to that key concept. Okay, so topic 8.4 for the millionth time, economic growth in the years after World War I. Just wanted to keep your mind coming back to this is all leading into economic growth. Private sector, federal spending, baby boom, technological developments leading to economic growth. The one we just wrapped up, explain the causes and effects of migration of various groups after 1945. If this was, some sort of, AP question, you could use that contextualization of, urbanization, really since period 6, first and second Great Migrations, and now you have movement back to the South, but now to like the south of like Florida, as well as to the West. And then the key concept as higher education opportunities, such as the GI Bill and new technologies rapidly expanded, increasing social mobility, more middle-class people, encourage the migration of the middle class to the suburbs and of many Americans to the South and West. And a lot of the, again, for middle-class jobs in like government contracting agencies. The Sunbelt region emerged as a significant political and economic force, and they're going to get more and more votes in the Electoral Congress, as well as that economic force of having a lot of government contractors that carry a lot of sway in Congress, as well as people who work for those government contractors. Okay, culture after 1945. This is page 14. I'm flipping my packet. Our key question here. Explain how mass culture has maintained or challenged the status quo over time. So a lot of maintaining, but some challenging. And our key concept, mass culture became more homogeneous, homogeneity, right? You know it from science class, homogeneous. In the post-war years, inspiring challenges to conformity by artists, intellectuals, and rebellious youth. Here we go. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of these things. But where movies and radio were the primary conveyors of culture since really the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, television really becomes the primary conveyor of culture and especially consumer culture in the 1950s. Sorry, I'm going to flip back here. I love this duality. This is, a photoshopped picture, but that you have this like perfect classroom and students over here, and then nuclear proliferation over there. Very much a symbol of the 1950s. TV shows, like here on the left, I Love Lucy. I think we have 1 or 2 groups doing I Love Lucy for their research projects. And then the Milton Berle Show over here on the right. In all cases, these are, married families with, a few children. Some of the research projects, especially for I Love Lucy, focusing on that Lucy and Desi had separate beds, were never shown in their bedroom until several seasons, and then had to have separate beds. So television is very much self-censored in this time period, and that's part of that Eisenhower theme of moving from overt to covert. And so the Red Scare, and that's why we start off with that brief video on McCarthyism, the Red Scare has now gone covert instead of overt. It's not going to be these huge public hearings. It's now everyone's fear of standing out. And so even our TV shows are going to convey that message and conform to that message. You have this glossy view of mostly middle-class suburban life. Now, the Honeymooners are an exception to that. They are a working-class family. They do live in the city. But for the most part, our television perception of families are the Donna Reed Show and Leave It to Beaver, Fathers Knows Best, and Ozzie and Harriet Show. On the last video you guys watched, or maybe earlier on this video, I said the census revealed in 1960 that American families had, I think, 2.4 children. And if you add up all the kids here, you get like 2.4, maybe slightly less than that. Yeah, because this family has two, and then there's 3 kids over here. I was going to say on children. All of these shows really span the 50s and go into the 60s for the most part. They're suburban families. None of these families happen to be in the cities. They all have professional working fathers, doctors, kind of undeclared, like corporate executive types, and stay-at-home mothers. There are TV shows in the early 1950s. There's one called Life with Luigi that shows an Italian family, but they don't survive the 50s. They only make it a season or 2. These are the enduring images of the 50s because they reflect what many Americans wanted of themselves in the 1950s and expected out of others. Television helps portray consumerism. Print advertising, print media still exist, but now you have television advertising. And that goes back to that I Love Lucy still I showed you 2 slides ago from the Vita Vegemin commercial. That transistor radio down here, these new technological advancements. The TVs back then were kind of these big chess cabinet televisions. The first television had actually come out in 1926 or 27, but its picture was about the size of a note card, so think about the size of like my cell phone. The transistor is going to be able to get a big enough picture that you can sit and really watch a television in the room. But consumerism, Tupperware, plastics had been available, but not really scalable for commercial use. You now have Tupperware coming out in the 1950s, and then even style. This is the Iron Curtain look. See how the Cold War is influencing even style in the 1950s. Consumerism is also music. We're listening to music on the radio, which of course we're buying more and more of, but we're also buying records, the old LPs of the 1950s. Kids would want to go out and buy those records. At first it's records, and it becomes briefly 8 tracks, and then tapes and CDs, and then MP3s. I don't even know how you guys, if you buy music anymore. I guess music subscription services. But the music of the early 1950s is dominated by doo-wop, but rock and roll quickly struck a chord with American listeners. And you're going to have both black and white rock and roll artists. And a couple of the groups are doing, for their research projects, people like Elvis, Buddy Holly. I think one group is doing Jerry Lee Lewis. I think somebody's doing Ray Charles, and several groups are doing rock and roll in general. This is a continuation of the Great Migration, and especially the first Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. because African American, especially blues, has come to the North with the Great Migration. And this is really what becomes rock and roll culture. The guitar, the call and response pattern of slave music becomes the chorus and verse pattern of rock and roll music, and really changes the American landscape. Oh, there's Elvis. I don't know why he popped up later. So for televisions in 1946, I think I'd given the statistic in class, there's only 7,000 TV sets in the United States. By 1950, it's 50 million television sets in the United States. And so this mass audience of television viewers celebrates traditional American values. Like Superman, the television show from the 50s, represents truth, justice, and the American way. Television celebrated America's like pioneer days and the whole manifest destiny and rugged American ideal of the West. Popular TV shows, Davy Crockett, The Lone Ranger, and Gunsmoke. Teen culture, and this is where you start to get into that second part of the key concept of rebellious youth, celebrated sometimes speaking out against this norm. The fear at the time is of juvenile delinquency. And many of you may start to have been reading J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, where he's really questioning the conformity of the 1950s culture. We see it in movies like Marlon Brando in The Wild One, and James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, that they're starting to fight back against these cultural tropes that are being advanced in the 1950s. I think I come back to the Beat Generation, but it says, again, by rebellious youth and artists. The Beats would be both I would say more artists than necessarily rebellious youth. But Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg really become the Nobel laureates, so to speak, of the Beat Generation. Neil Cassidy, William S. Burroughs. This is from a TV show, Dobie Gillis, where Dobie Gillis over here is like the clean teen, and Maynard G. Krebs is like the beatnik. This is like kind of like cleaned up for television version. But we'll come back to the Beats here in a second. I kind of got out of order. And then there's like all these like fun 50s kind of questionable movies that haven't really survived the test of time. Like this one over here is Date Bait. I'm not exactly sure what that movie was about. Okay, so one thing I want to do on our session on Friday is talk about this song, Little Boxes. It is in your packet, page 16. I should have put that on the slide. And I'll play a little bit for you now.
Little boxes on the hillside. Little boxes made of ticky-tacky. Little boxes on the hillside. Little boxes all the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same.
Sorry, I'm singing along with her. So for a discussion on, I think it's on Friday, I want you to look through the song, read through the lyrics. I can post a link to the song on the homework document. And you listen through the whole thing. Analyze the rhetorical devices that Malverna Reynolds, the author, uses to make her point. How does her choice of rhetoric contribute to her main idea? And through that, we'll kind of, suss out what is her point and what is her main idea. I think no song better represents like the 50s, in the 50s, as Little Boxes does. If it sounds familiar to some of you, it was the theme song on Weeds. I don't think it's still on, but some of you may watch it. Okay, last couple of things I want to talk about for this one is areas of greatest growth. Suburbs lead to church membership. America becomes more religious by the end of the decade. I give you the church membership statistics here, so you can see church membership almost doubles over the 1940s and 50s. Religious preference becomes a primary identifying feature of the suburbs. you have the popularity of a Methodist minister, Norman Vincent Peale, and the power of positive thinking, and Reverend Billy Graham, which I think one group did do for their research project. An ecumenical message, kind of like the Second Great Awakening with evangelicalism, warned against the evils of communism and become a good Christian to combat communism. And we've talked about that in class with the addition of Under God to the Pledge and In God We Trust on Our Money in 1953. And then a kind of a repetition of things we've talked about. And you see that religious revival in Hollywood and popular culture as well. I tried to get somebody to do 10 Commandments and Ben-Hur, but I don't think anybody took me up on it. But this is the apex of the biblical epics. I think the 10 Commandments is still on every Easter, unlike ABC, I believe. All of The Robe is not, I think, so well known today. I did have Richard Burton, who is Elizabeth Taylor's husband, in it. I think they were still married at the time. This is, Hollywood and consumer culture and this religious revival of the 1950s. So, go back. All of these are kind of interconnected. There's a spider web of topics here. So the causes of economic growth in the years after World War II is the consumer culture we just talked about. People buying radios and records and record players and televisions and going to see movies. It's the burgeoning private sector of the movie industry and music industry, as well as the government private sector, government contractor private sector. It's federal spending on the highways, but also on research and development. It's the baby boom, which leads to more children, which leads to the growth of this youth culture, and the technological developments that spur economic growth. Economy, this is all the Sunbelt stuff. And then our key question for 8.5, culture after 1945, explain how mass culture, television, radio, movies, music, has maintained or challenged the status quo over time. Mass culture became increasingly homogeneous in the post-war years, inspiring challenges to conformity by artists, intellectuals, and rebellious youth. That's the last thing we're going to try and do, just hit up a few of these critics. William White's Organized Man and David Reisman's Lonely Crowd criticized American conformity to social pressures. And Reisman really said, this loss of individuality is making us feel lonely, like we're just one person in this conformist crowd. And then I mentioned earlier Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg should be mentioned, and the Beats, short for the Beatniks, emerged as the new counterculture by refusing to conform to 1950s culture. Think of them as the hipsters of the 1950s. And this is going to lead into the counterculture reactionaries of the 1960s that we'll be talking about in probably 2 or 3 weeks. These are the predecessors, especially the Beats, to the hippies of the 1960s and 70s, as well as other reactionaries, more intellectual reactionaries of the 1960s. One of the famous movies, here's Gregory Peck in The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, come from William Sloane's book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, talking about corporate culture, the company man, and that how you have to fit into this corporate culture. Notice it's very middle class, white collar. The Beatniks are the 1950s, not exactly equivalent, but the 1950s version of the Lost Generation from the 1920s. They're young, they're artists, writers that are challenging conformity. So Fitzgerald of the 1920s and his rejection of consumerism, material society, is now reflected, that same idea, in the Beats, or the Beatniks of the 1950s and move into the 1960s. So here from John Slelon Holmes and I were sitting around trying to think up the meaning of the Lost Generation and the subsequent existentialism. And I said, John, this is really the Beat generation. And he leapt up and said, that's right. This idea that they're beat up, they're beat down. You see them overtly tying themselves to the Lost Generation. We explored the first day of the unit. What does existentialism mean? And if you ever listen to, and I think we actually listened to it in class later on when we do an activity, Rainy Day Women, 12 and 35 by Bob Dylan, he interprets this as they're being stoned, and he uses the double meaning of stoned, but that this generation is being beat on, or they're being stoned by older people who just don't understand. So this bookstore here, City Lights in San Francisco, is a hotbed of beat artists, and will in a decade become, on the corner of Haight and Ashbury, become the epicenter of the hippie movement in the United States. And I'm very transparent. I'm not an art person. It's not that I don't appreciate it. I just don't understand it. But here, this is actually not Mark Rothko. This is Jackson Pollock. There's Jackson Pollock at work with the splatter painting idea. And somewhere I have a Mark Rothko on here. There we go. These are Mark Rothkos. I do not understand the Mark Rothkos. Speaking out against the conformity by being very nonconformist artist, by being very different and standing out from the crowd. Also in here we have well-defined gender roles, and this could very much be up in that suburbanization and conformity section. This is a quotation from Life magazine in 1956. The ideal modern woman married, cooked, and cared for her family, and kept herself busy by joining the local PTA and leading a troupe of campfire girls. She entertained guests in her family's suburban house and worked out on the trampoline to maintain her size 12 figure. So girls in the class would probably be shocked when we get to size 12, because very much today that would be considered like verging on like plus size. And the ideal size, I have no clue what the ideal size is anymore. But, like this Marilyn Monroe, who fluctuated throughout her career between a size 6 and a 16, probably most notable in some more like size 8, 10, and 12, was considered like the ideal woman. But this concept is later criticized by Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique. So I'm going to let you guys pause this here and read, because we're going to come back to it in our discussion on Friday, The Feminine Mystique. So pause it here. And I'm going to go on, and you can pause it here again. So we had talked about a little bit about this in during World War II, when we read that primary source by, still can't remember, Gwen Gannett or something. And here, in the 50s, Friedan doesn't publish The Feminine Mystique until the 60s, but as a sociology student, she is studying the 1950s, and it's her analysis of the 50s. And this is very much another stepping stone from World War II to the 1950s into the women's rights movement of the 60s and 70s. In class, we also talked about Kinsey. Many of you are familiar with the Kinsey scale. Published his studies of the sexual behavior in human male, and then subsequently the human female. And he's saying many of these like ideal conformist ideas of people in the 1950s as being so prim and proper is not true. People are having premarital sex. Extramarital affairs are frequent, common, and more people are actually heterosexual than we, as a society in the 1950s, admitted, where the norm was really considered, more people are homosexual. My husband's giving me a weird look. Homosexual than this like heteronormative society of the 1950s. And here is a reaction in the early 1950s to Kinsey's. Kinsey's results are an assault on the family as a basic unit of society, a negation of moral law, and a celebration of licentiousness. So notice they're not upset about his findings, but more like that he's finding these things. It's not, the anger isn't placed on like, what's going on in America. It's based on that, like, Kinsey is talking about it. Okay, so this is another thing I'm going to come back to on Friday from 2018, both their fourth short answer question as well as their LEQ. The short answer question, you can pause and read for yourself. We'll come back to it on Friday, as well as the LEQ, and start to talk about